examples of extra-biblical writings given in the session, which ones do you consider the most interesting, credible, or compelling? Elaborate. So the things that we've talked about with other people who, other writings outside the gospel, which of those, really caught your eye or ear the most? And say why. Why is interesting? And now we'll go to question 6. And there's a chart there. We'll take a look. It says, examine the following chart that compares some of the teachings in the most popular Gnostic gospel, the Gospel of Thomas, to the teachings of the New Testament. Do you see any way the teachings of Thomas can be reconciled with the biblical teachings? Why or why not? So, now this comes up, this idea of what are the so-called Gnostic Gospels. Excuse me. Now, Gnosticism was a heresy that appears in the church. It was against what the main Christian church believed. That really pops up, especially in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries. And they had these own writings that said, oh yeah, these are gospels that are written and this is really what happened. Now, if you watch something in the Bible from the History Channel, the Discovery Channel, something like that, you might see them saying, oh, but there are the hidden gospels, the secret gospels kept from the church, kept from people by the church. And that's kind of this idea that, oh yeah, there were these other gospels. Oh, and the church doesn't want you to read them. Maybe they have the truth. Well, let's take a look at the Gnostic Gospels. One of the most common ones you'll hear about it is called the Gospel of Thomas. Claimed to be written by Thomas, it wasn't. And it's written between, as it says here, between 100 and 500 AD. So let's look at that chart there that you have in Pear Deck. It says, the Gospel, who is Jesus? Well, according to the Gospel of Thomas, it's someone who imparts secret teachings to disciples who are mature enough to receive it. This idea that, there's, Jesus is here to deliver this secret knowledge just to a few people. Whereas in the New Testament, we see that Jesus is the Redeemer who saves his people from sin. It's a big deal. It's for all people. Well, what does the Gospel of Thomas say about salvation? Well, the Gospel of Thomas says salvation comes through a special, secret knowledge. You have to be worthy to receive that knowledge. Now look, who's putting the emphasis on? It's put on the people. Oh, I have to be worthy enough to receive that knowledge. Well, the focus turns to people, what the people do to get right with God. That doesn't match up with the Jesus that we see in our Bible. In the New Testament, it's clear salvation comes through faith in Jesus. And you can't take credit for this. It's a gift from God. Now let's see what Thomas says about fasting, prayer, and giving. It says, if you fast, if you decide not to eat, you're giving up certain foods or giving up eating altogether for a certain amount of time, you will bring sin upon yourselves. And if you pray, you will be condemned. If you give to charity, you will harm your spirits. That doesn't sound like what we hear from Jesus in the New Testament, right? And Jesus says in directions for fasting, when you fast, comb your hair and wash your face. Don't make it obvious that you're fasting. In Ephesians, Paul writes, and pray to the Spirit on all occasions with all kinds of prayers and requests. Right? Prayer is a big thing, right? Jesus taught his disciples how to pray. That's the Lord's Prayer. Prayer is kind of a big deal. It's a really big deal. And giving, Romans says, if your gift is giving, then give generously. There's a story of Jesus and the widow, who gives all that she has, even though it's not much. Jesus says this, she's given the most. Fasting, prayer, and giving are definitely things that line up with Jesus, what we know, what Christianity's accepted. And these Gnostic Gospels are written much later. So back to the question 6 there. Is there any way, let's talk about, look at the things I just read there. Do you see any way the teachings of Thomas can be reconciled? Is there any way they fit together with what's in the New Testament? Why are we not? I'll let you decide what you write there, but hopefully it should be obvious for you. All right, on to question 7. Here's what Gregory Boyd writes first of all. There are no new discoveries that tell us anything new about Jesus. The Gospel of Thomas was discovered long ago. It was only now being used to create an alternative Jesus. Some theories of the Gospel of Thomas may be new, but the Gospel itself is not. These were written a long time ago. Not as long as the Gospels were written, but they were written a long time ago. So Christians have already gone through this and said, yeah, that's not what really happened. Let's look at this number 7 here. The various Gnostic Gospels were written sometime between the late 2nd century and the 6th century A.D. Well, even the most skeptical scholars concede the biblical Gospels were written in the 1st century. Mostly within 50 years of Jesus living and dying. Jesus was executed in either AD 30 or 33. Most experts date the Gospel of Mark to the late 50s or early 60s, the Gospels of Matthew and Luke to the early 60s, and the Gospel of John to the 90s. Although some scholars have argued that John was written a lot earlier. So what does the dating of the Gospel tell you regarding its credibility? How important is it to you that an ancient document was written close to the events it describes? How significant is it that the biblical Gospels were authored by actual apostles of Jesus or persons associated with his Gospels, while the Gnostic Gospels were not? Right, is it a big deal, do you think, that they were written close to the actual events? Does that help their credibility, that they weren't written years later? Does it help their credibility that the authors of the Gospels were there in Matthew and John's case, or talked to a lot of people who were there, as in Mark and Luke's case? Is that good evidence for the Gospels being true? Is it important that when you compare the Gospels we have in the New Testament with the Gnostic Gospels, is that helpful that the people who wrote the Gospels in the New Testament were actually there? They actually knew Jesus, whereas the Gnostic Gospels didn't. Now, the Gnostic Gospels sometimes attach people's names to their Gospels. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Thomas, and the Gospel of Philip, and so forth. But that doesn't mean, just because they're slapping that name on it, doesn't mean that they were the ones who actually wrote it. On to the next. Think about this. This first one's from a fictional character in the book The Da Vinci Code, Sir Lee Teabing. And but even though he's a fictional character, this summarizes this point of view that the people try to push. Sometimes you'll see, like I said, you might see it in the Discovery Channel, the History Channel, or something, a documentary like that. Where here's what he says. More than 80 Gospels were considered for the New Testament. Yet only a relative few were chosen for inclusion, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John among them. Teabing located a huge book and pulled it toward him across the table. The leather-bound edition was poster-sized, like a huge atlas. The cover read, "The Gnostic Gospels." Teabing heaved it open. "These are photocopies of the earliest Christian records. Troublingly, they don't match up with the Gospels in the Bible." Flipping toward the middle of the book, Teabing pointed to a passage. The Gospel of Philip is always a good place to start. So he said, oh, well, yeah, there were all these Gospels. And the church leaders, they just chose the ones that they liked the best. The New Testament Mark Strauss says, there's a view among some that there were all these different competing views of Jesus Christ, and the one that won out and became the orthodox, the regular mainstream perspective of Christ reflecting the Gospels. All evidence runs contrary to that. There wasn't this huge titanic struggle between people who said the Gnostic Gospels were right and the original Gospels were right. The vast majority of everyone realized, this is the New Testament. These all go along with it. And the stuff in these Gnostic Gospels that the Gnostics have come up with and written and claimed that they're written by other people doesn't match what's in the New Testament. Here's what Gregory Boyd says. Jesus is not a symbol of anything unless he's rooted in history. The Nicene Creed doesn't say, we wish these things were true. It says Jesus Christ was crucified under Pontius Pilate, and the third day he rose again from the dead. And it goes on from there. The theological truth is based on historical truth. That's the way the New Testament reads. Look at the sermon of Peter in the 2nd chapter of Acts. He stands up and says, you guys are witnesses of these things. They weren't done in secret. The apostles say, this is the way it really happened. Let's think about that as we go on to the next question, where he said, question 8 here. It says, Gregory Boyd states, I don't want to base my life on a symbol. I want reality. What do you think he means by this? What's he saying when he says, I don't want to base my life on a symbol? Do you agree or disagree with his conviction, with his idea that you don't want to base your life on a symbol? Do you agree with that or not? Is it enough that Jesus is a symbol of hope? Or is it important for you to be confident that his life, teachings, and resurrection are rooted in history? Why? For some people it's enough. Oh yeah, Jesus, he was there. He was, this person who makes us feel good. Good teachings that Jesus. For some people that's enough. But if we think about it, is it really enough? Or does it matter that Jesus was really a real person, that he really lived? He really suffered under Pontius Pilate. He was really crucified. He really died. He was really put in a tomb. Most importantly, that he really rose again. Paul writes that if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, our whole faith falls apart. But I'm interested to hear your opinion. Does it matter if Jesus is just a symbol, or does he need to be rooted in reality? Let's look at the last think about this from Gregory Boyd. What do these scholars have? Well, there's a brief allusion to a lost secret gospel in the late 2nd century letter that has unfortunately only been seen by one person and has now itself been lost. There's a 3rd century account of the crucifixion and resurrection that stars a talking cross that less than a handful of scholars think predates the gospel. There's a 2nd century Gnostic document, parts of which some scholars now want to date early to back up their own preconceptions. And there's a hypothetical document built on shaky assumptions that's being sliced thinner and thinner by using circular reason. No, I'm sorry, don't buy it. It's far more reasonable to put my trust in the 4 biblical Gospels. They pass the test of historical scrutiny with flying colors. When we put what happened in the Gospels up against history, where's the corroborating evidence? Well, for the Gospels, it's there. We can be certain that these events really happened. They really happened, and even people who weren't Christians agree that, that Jesus was a real guy, that he really taught, that he really suffered, really died, and his followers say he rose from the dead. That's important for us. We can know for certain that we have salvation because of what Jesus has done for us. All right, well, thank you for being part of our class today and filling out the Pear Deck as we go along. If you're watching this much later, the Pear Deck will probably not be available to you, but I hope you still enjoyed our discussion. Um, in case you didn't know, this stuff is from The Case for Christ. It's a book by Lee Strobel, and what we've been going through is one made to go along with the videos for a study session. I contacted the people from the book, and I wanted to adapt it for classroom use, and they gave me permission to do that. And so I assumed that this is probably an okay step taken with the coronavirus and so forth. So I'm glad you were able to be part of class today, and thank you for watching this. God's blessings. Have a great day.